For as long as people have been painting, they have been doing so on wood panels. An amazingly strong, long-lasting, and really wonderful substrate for paintings, it does come with some pitfalls. As in the case of this painting on panel, it has split into two pieces. Bursting along the grain, right in the middle of the painting, this thin panel is now in two, which is obviously a big problem. There are good things about this split. It hasn't been conserved or tinkered with. There hasn't been a ton of paint loss. The rest of the panel is basically sound, and the painting looks pretty good. But aside from the split, there is another issue here at play that must be reckoned with. Yes, the painting is dirty and it needs to be cleaned and retouched, but we're talking about a bow in the panel. This wood has cupped, and this distortion is problematic, not only because it makes putting the painting into a frame impossible, but it's also distasteful to the client. And so, these are the pitfalls of painting on panel. Pitfalls that we will now have to reckon with. Before I can deal with any of the issues that this panel painting is presenting, the dirtiness, the old varnish, the retouching, or even the bow, I have to first make it one piece. I can't do anything until it's joined. So over to the clampinator we go. And the clampinator is a multi-axis clamping machine that I built many years ago, specifically to glue split panels back together. For years, I used to do this using clamps and cawls, band straps, contraptions, all sorts of doohickeys, and it was fine. But I thought I could do better than fine, so I designed and built this system. What it allows me to do is exert force, through the clamps on 4 different sides of the piece. And that's the important thing. If this panel were as flat as a board, how about that, right? Then clamping it up would be easy. 2 clamps on the sides and a little bit of glue and it would be fine. But this panel isn't. It's cupped, it's warped, it's distorted. And so just exerting pressure on the sides to close the joint up isn't possible because of that warp. Imagine a curved piece of paper and you press on the sides. Well, it's just going to continue bowing in whichever direction it's bowed. And on a piece of wood, it's going to split. So that's where the clampinator is really unique, is that it allows me to keep the shape of the bowed wood while exerting pressure on the sides. It sounds a little bit complicated, and I guess it is if you haven't used the device before, but once you understand the way it works, it's very simple. There's a lot of setup, because once you apply the glue, the clock starts ticking and you don't have a lot of time. So making sure everything is the way it should be, mise en place, so to speak, and ready for action is critical. And it starts by orienting the panel underneath the vertical clamping. And I want to make sure that split is aligned with that row of vertical clamps. Once it is, I can then move the side clamps into position. These are the clamps that are going to close up that joint, whereas the vertical clamps are going to hold everything in place. I can move the side clamps until I've got them where I want, tighten them down, and then begin preparing the vertical clamps. I need to raise them up, place underneath a couple of release blocks. These help distribute the clamping pressure, but also have felt and silicone release film on them so that nothing gets stuck to the panel. And then when everything is in place, I can apply the glue. And here I'm using a hide glue. The reason I'm using a hide glue is because it's reversible, so if this doesn't work, I can undo it. And I can remove it from the face of the painting if there's any squeeze out. And of course, a good glue joint always has a little bit of squeeze out. Otherwise, it's a starved joint and it's, well, not good. You can see how I spilled a whole bunch on the face. If I were using a PVA glue or an epoxy, removing that might be impossible. With the glue applied, I put the pieces into the machine. I place the release blocks on top of the joint, and then I start clamping everything down. And you can see the panel is bowed, and the clamps are at the highest point. The shape is maintained. I'm not trying to flatten this and then glue it up. I'm trying to glue it up in its distorted state, because that's where I will get the best contact between the two pieces. I'll go ahead and make sure that the top and bottom clamps are all even, that they're exerting pressure and holding the panel in place. And then I can start applying pressure with the clamps on the sides. I'd like to go slow here because there's no benefit to rushing. I've spent a lot of time orienting everything where I want it so that I have the luxury of taking my time here. I'll move from clamp to clamp, adding a little bit of tension, checking the joint, adding a little bit more tension, checking the joint, so on and so forth. I want to make sure that it's completely flush. And then I just wait. Let the glue do its thing. Leave it overnight in the clamping table and keep my fingers crossed that everything works out. Actually, I've done this plenty of times and I don't have to keep my fingers crossed. I know it's going to work out. That was the whole point of designing this thing. And here you can see specifically what I'm talking about. The panel is bowed. It is still bowed. And yet the downward and upward pressure from the vertical clamps keeps it from distorting any further and allows the pressure from the side clamps to close up that joint. This is the magic behind the Clampinator. This is why I designed and built it, specifically for instances where panels are distorted or bowed or just not flat and split and need to be bonded back together. This is the Clampinator's raison d'etre. After a day, I can come back and take the panel out of traction. Again, moving really slowly. I don't want to do anything here that is going to upset the panel or cause any rapid changes. I'm just going to begin to take off the pressure. One clamp at a time, moving back and forth, making sure that it's released nice and evenly, giving the wood a little bit of time to relax. And then that's it. I can move on to the hard part. What, you thought this was the hard part? I mentioned one of the pitfalls of painting on panel is the fact that wood warps. But let's understand why wood cups or distorts. First we have a tree and somebody cuts it down, and then they decide to cut out a piece to make a panel. Now this piece is flat sawn, and it contains grain in an arc. As the wood dries, the moisture starts to evaporate, and more evaporates on the top because there is more grain area, and the grain wants to flatten out. And when it does, well, we get a cupped piece of wood. That's what we have here. No good. Not for building with, and certainly not for painting on. But we can uncup it. By adding moisture to, we can expand the cellular structure of the wood, and then it will become flat again. But here we have another problem, because the moisture that we've just added to the wood is also going to evaporate. And when it does, bingo, we have another cupped piece of wood. So while the moisture is still in the wood, if we can replace it with something while it's evaporating, something that won't evaporate and stays, we might just have a shot at flattening this panel. The first step in correcting this cup is to relax the wood through the application of water. But before I can do that, I need to protect the glue joint because hide glue is hygroscopic. It will absorb water and become soft, and that would result in a compromised joint. And I spent a lot of time gluing this panel back up, so I don't want it to come apart. It seems like this tape is futile, but it will do a fantastic job of protecting that glue joint, and that's why I use it. Every piece of wood has a fiber saturation point, and for this wood and most, it's about 28%. And that means that when the moisture content gets below 28%, the wood will start to distort. And that moisture content gets low because the moisture in the wood, the water, evaporates. There's bound water and unbound water, and it's a really interesting science that I'm not going to get too deep into here. But through the application of water, we can soften that wood, and we can return it to a state before it got below the fiber saturation point and started distorting. So I've painted on some water, and I've covered it with some film, and I'm going to let it sit. Some panels take a couple hours, some take a couple of days. This one reacted fairly quickly. And as I peel back this film, you can see just how flat this panel is now. Its fiber saturation point is above 28%. And though there is still a little bit of distortion, this is really good. Perfectly flat would require laminating this to something, and we don't want to do that. And now comes the fun part. I mentioned that this water is now actively evaporating, and it's doing so at a fairly slow rate. But I want to speed it up. I don't want to be here all week watching this wood dry. I watch paint dry enough. So I've added a solvent into the water, and I'm going to paint it on the wood, and it's going to speed up the evaporation of the water and the solvent. After a little bit of time, I'm going to come back and switch to pure solvent. And I want to get as much of this moisture now out of the wood as quickly as possible, because I have this small window where the wood will be dry enough to accept the next solution, but yet still pliable and not returning to a bowed state. Into that window, I can now inject this new solution. And this solution is really the secret sauce. It's a combination of water, solvent, and another ingredient. And what it's going to do is take the place of the water in the swollen wood. You remember I spent a bunch of time removing that water quickly, so we're probably close to 28%. But I want to get it down to single digits. I don't want this wood wet. And so over the course of several days, the rest of the water is going to start evaporating. And as it does, this solution is going to take the place of that water in the cellular structure of the wood, keeping it flat. We spent a lot of time swelling that wood, expanding that cellular structure, getting it flat. And now, while it's flat, we're going to replace any moisture that remains with this solution. And because this solution doesn't evaporate, because it doesn't shrink, and because it's water soluble, it's going to keep the wood in that swollen state. But it's not going to be wet with water. And so after applying this several times over a couple of days, well, I'm happy with the state of the wood. I can remove the tape, and lo and behold, the glue joint was protected. We have a single panel with no distortion. And that means that we can move on to the fairly simple and routine procedures that just about every painting in my studio will receive. And that's cleaning, removal of surface grime, and old varnish. Before I do that, however, I want to remove any of that excess hide glue that's squeezed out. And you can see with just a little bit of warm water, I can do so. It doesn't harm the glue joint because I'm not using a ton, and voila, all of the glue is gone. Not possible with epoxy. So on to cleaning. And I'm going to start by testing to see what kind of surface grime is on the painting surface, because this often stands in the way of solvents ever reaching the varnish layer and removing the varnish. So with a little bit of paste applied, I can see that, well, there isn't really much surface grime at all. In fact, there's so little that I'm not going to bother trying to remove it as a separate step. I'm going to go right to removing the varnish because I think that the solvent will penetrate through that layer easily enough. And lo and behold, it does. The solvent is swelling that varnish, and then the swab is picking it up while it's soft and removing it from that painting. and revealing something pretty special. Instead of a yellow-brown sky, it's kind of blue. I always knew it would be, but seeing it is still pretty cool. I've said it once, and I'll say it again. It never gets boring. Removing this old varnish is not terribly difficult. Sometimes it is, but on this painting, it's an old natural resin damar. And the damar resin comes from a tree in Southeast Asia. When you cut the tree, the sap comes out, it gets refined, boiled down, dried, turned into crystals, reconstituted with solvent, painted on paintings, and then it begins its slow process of deterioration. In fact, damar starts to yellow within about a month of being applied, if exposed to any ambient light. The ultraviolet rays in sunlight corrupt the varnish, make it brittle or milky, crack, or most often brownish yellow. And so we want to remove it, because the artist never imagined that their painting would be this dark. When they applied that varnish, it was clear, shiny, made the painting look good, and that's what they expected. But they didn't know it was going to change over time. And even if they did, they didn't have any alternatives. This was the best that they had, so they worked with it. But now we know how to remove it, and we know how we can replace it with something better. And so the cleaning process, or the varnish removal process, is one that seeks to return the painting to what the artist envisioned when they decided it was complete. There is no such thing as a patina on a painting. If the artist wanted this painting tinted, they would add a glaze to simulate that effect. But this is just the evidence of deterioration over time. And this isn't something that the artist deliberately did. There are some artists who do things to their artworks with degradation and deterioration in mind, but this is not one of those pieces. Whitaker, the artist here, just wanted to paint a beautiful painting. And even though the majority of this painting is dark, cleaning off the varnish does reveal some interesting things. There are some blues in here. There's even a few pinks behind some of these greens. And even in the dark areas, the removal of the old varnish adds clarity, because the old varnish isn't just yellow and brown, it's starting to become milky, and that obfuscates what we can see. And so it seems like removing a brown varnish from a brown landscape painting wouldn't be impactful, but it is. And it's absolutely critical to returning this painting to its original state, the state that the artist decided it should be in when they completed it. I always leave the signature for last because it can often be the most delicate part of a painting. The artist may thin out the paints to make it easier to sign their name, and whenever one thins out the paint with a solvent, it thins out the binder and it makes the paint more fugitive or less stable. So I leave it to the end so that I have a better understanding of the painting, and then I go over it very delicately. Once I'm happy with the approach, well, the signature's clean. Because this painting split into two, there is some paint loss along the seam. Not a lot, but I still need to fill it in, because if I don't, the light will catch those little divots and it will reveal the joint, something that I've worked very hard to avoid. So using a little bit of fill-in medium here, I can just overfill and then begin to remove. Luckily, there isn't a ton of fill-in here. It's just a little bit along that seam. And the irony is that when I'm done removing this, it's going to be almost nothing remaining on the painting. And that's totally okay. The less fill-in that we have to use, the better. In fact, we only want the fill-in where the paint has been lost, not building up around it, not on top of original paint. So removing as much as possible is the name of the game. And I can use a combination of swabs and my fingertips just to rub it off. And you can see there's almost nothing to see, which is indicative of a really good glue joint, one that's almost perfect. But the process of conservation and restoration isn't complete without retouching. because of course there is a gap and we need to fill it in with something so that we don't see it. Rather than using oil paints, which dry and oxidize through exposure to oxygen and become permanent, I'm using resin-based paints. Synthetic and designed for conservation, these are permanently soluble. In 5 years, 50 years, 150 years, probably 500 years, we'll have to see. These paints can be removed with the application of solvent. They're light fast and won't change colors, and they can be seen under UV light, so we can reveal where retouching has been added. They are a critical tool in the conservator's toolbox. What they are not, however, is oil paint, and working with them presents a bit of unique challenges. This paint dries fairly quickly. It's very hard to blend or mix on canvas, unlike oil paint. It's not very thick, so if you need to build up texture, you have to do so with the fill-in medium. In addition, this paint doesn't mix like oil paint, even though the colors share the same names: Alizarian crimson, titanium white, ultramarine blue, phthalo blue, cadmium yellow light. The colors aren't exactly the same. Yes, the pigments may be, but the suspension in a synthetic resin changes the way that they act. But like anything, with enough practice, one starts to learn the medium, and then it just becomes an extension of your hand and your thoughts. The retouching on this painting is not all that complicated. It's a tiny line that runs horizontally through a fairly busy painting. But we still need to make that line disappear, because if it's present, it will reveal the fact that this painting's split. So we retouch by just adding paint where the paint is missing. Just a little bit at a time, little dots here and there to bring that seam into accord with the surrounding image. We don't overpaint, we don't glaze in, we just add paint where paint was missing. That's how retouching works. And if done well, everything disappears and all you see is the painting. With the retouching complete, it's now time to apply the final varnish. And unlike the natural resin coating, the damar from that tree, this is a synthetic resin designed in a laboratory for this specific purpose. It's archival, it's fully reversible, it's flexible, it doesn't turn yellow because it's ultraviolet stabilized, and removing it is very easy. So by all accounts, it's superior to the natural resin. I've decided to brush on the varnish and then brush it out as the solvent is evaporating from the resin. This results in a finish that's glossy but not plastic looking. It's got a little bit of a crystalline effect, one that I think will suit this painting quite well. So, there it is. All the work complete, and the painting ready to go back home. Clearly, when this painting arrived, I knew that it needed to be bonded back together. I knew it needed to be cleaned. I knew that there was going to be some retouching, new varnish, etc. But addressing the cupping, the distortion of the wood, was one that presented a unique challenge. One that required some creative thinking and some novel approaches. But here's the thing. That's what conservation is all about. That's what makes this work exciting. Challenges and trying new things. None were too great or complicated to stand in the way of perseverance.